Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris.
Shortly, we'll be joined by Faisal Islam because he's talking about the Chancellor's Mais Lecture. I think I remember once, Chris, you talking about that, saying, was it maize like corn?
Yes.
That is maize named after a person.
It is M-A-I-S, not
Yes.
M-A-I-Z-E, or indeed the sort of thing that at a country house you might run around trying to find the middle of.
Right, I really need to get back into work mode. This first few minutes has definitely been holiday mode. Right, focus. Well, actually, something important to focus on, the war in Ukraine, which was kind of back on British soil today because Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was back addressing Parliament.
Yeah, and I had the privilege of getting to go into the room. And, it is the risk of sounding pious, I'm just going to do it anyway because it's kind of the essence of being a reporter. The essence of being a news reporter is getting to witness things and getting to be in the room when things happen. Now, quite often reporters find themselves the other side of the door to a room where the stuff is happening because we're not in there. For this, we were a handful of journalists alongside MPs and members of the House of Lords. One of the most extraordinary things I've witnessed journalistically in the last 4 or 5 years was when President Zelensky addressed Westminster Hall in Parliament around about 3 years ago, pretty much 1 year in to the war after the full-scale invasion in February 2022. And that was an extraordinary thing to witness because he is a master communicator. And at the time then, Adam, he was trying to make an argument about the dangers of war fatigue. And, here we are 3 years on, the war very much still live and real. And then the backdrop, of course, being that all the headlines are dominated by another war in the Middle East. And again, I thought you had this master communicator on show making an argument, twofold argument. One, that the conflict in the Middle East and the conflict in Ukraine are effectively one and the same thing. So he described Russia and Iran as brothers in hatred. And then the other argument he was making was that by necessity, Ukraine has become a pioneer in modern warfare, particularly drones, and that legacy of learning, if you like, is what Ukraine's allies in supporting his country will inherit both now and after any conflict in terms of how modern warfare now looks. And what he didn't do today, but it was implicit, was sort of bang the drum for more support. He didn't need to say that explicitly because it was implicit, I think, in the thrust of the argument he was making. It was a fascinating argument.
Well, yeah, just he's rhetorically made that switch from supplicant to I can help you out.
Yes, exactly that. And so shifting it round from exactly that sense of you need to help us because we are a friend in trouble. Obviously, clearly, from his perspective, that argument remains live. But flipping it round, as you say, to a sense of not just our front line is your front line, which has been part of his argument all the way through, but the nature of the conflict that Ukraine is currently both a victim of and a prosecutor of is the nature of conflict in the years and the decades ahead. And he talked at the beginning of the speech about how there are Ukrainians now in the Middle East sharing their expertise in the war with Iran, but then also the prospect of Europe on the front line of conflicts to come.
And we're recording this episode of Newscast at 5 to 7 in the evening on Tuesday, the 17th of March. And just before we started recording, Chris, Donald Trump was live in the Oval Office with the Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin to mark St. Patrick's Day, and another pop at Keir Starmer, although they're getting quite repetitive now and quite similar.
They are. So I was just catching up with this as I walked back over the road from Parliament, having been in the room with President Zelensky. And interestingly, another strand of President Trump's critique was a critique of NATO. And that critique was happening whilst the Prime Minister, President Zelensky, and the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, were all in the same room that I was also in, Committee Room 14 in Parliament. But yeah, as far as President Trump is concerned, he is... I said this in a piece I wrote for the BBC app this morning, and it remains true. Pretty much every time the President Trump, that is in front of a camera at the moment, he has a pop at Keir Starmer. Now, the critique is becoming familiar and the language is becoming familiar, and some of the arguments are becoming familiar, his critique around the UK's outlook on energy or immigration, for instance. His critique of Keir Starmer as a leader. I mean, I think what's interesting is the stickiness of it. Does this stickiness of it mean that it is less likely that it blows over? Or, given, for instance, the sort of volcanic nature of that meeting that we all recall between President Trump and President Zelensky just over a year ago, and given how they have since had much more kind of conventional diplomatic meetings, at least the bits we see in front of the camera, maybe it still can blow over. But it's so interesting that Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, was attempting to smooth things over, attempting to talk Keir Starmer up or defend him, and it didn't seem to work.
Keir Starmer has done a lot to reset the Irish-British relationship. I just want to put that on the record. But I do believe that he's a very earnest, sound person who I think you have a capacity to get on with. You've got on with him before. And you've got on with other European leaders as well. Sure. And I think you have that capacity again. And I think everyone exists. I mean, you cannot have a rogue state with a nuclear weapon or the capacity for a nuclear weapon.
And somebody who's not necessarily like coming to the Prime Minister's aid, but is becoming a little bit more anti-Trump is Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah, I think this is perhaps the most striking domestic contribution, if you like, politically today as we record. I'm now trying to pull up, because I was doing something else at the point where Kemi Badenoch said what she said. I am now, for the second newscast in a row, because on the edition we recorded on Monday, I was also flicking through my inbox trying to find something whilst talking. Yeah, I am Keir Starmer's biggest critic, she says. There's a lot of stuff I believe he has done that is wrong, but the words coming from the White House are completely wrong. I actually think it's quite childish. There is a lot that can be said behind closed doors. The Western alliance having an argument with itself, I think, sends the wrong signal to our opponents in Iran and Russia. The words coming from the White House were childish. And I think that's fascinating, because she is, and this is what you can do as an opposition leader that's much harder when you're a Prime Minister. She is able to be more critical, isn't she, than in public, than the Prime Minister feels, at least up to now, that he is able to be. And I think probably she recognises that while she has made a different argument around the Iran war and the role the UK should have played, the Conservatives arguing that the access to the airstrip should have been granted from the outset, not a couple of days in, but articulating a view I suspect she thinks is fairly close to the sort of median position amongst the British electorate when they see these exchanges, almost irrespective of their political views of President Trump and Keir Starmer.
And then we got, in terms of the substance of what's happening in the Middle East now, Donald Trump seems to have stepped back from his demand that NATO allies and China supply ships and resources to keep the Strait of Hormuz open.
Yes, I think broadly as a result of the fact that so few
everyone said no.
were expressing any enthusiasm for the idea. So I think what's intriguing now, what are we, 2 and a bit weeks into the war, is, we're beyond the point, aren't we, where, for everyone, by the way, but obviously particularly for America and Israel, where we're beyond the point where the initial kind of rhetorical flourishes and grand statements survive contact with reality anymore, because clearly the conflict rolls on. There's still all of those questions about what the end game is, what the precise desires of America and Israel, and by the way, they might not be the same, are. And then the extent to which, and Kemi Badenoch was speaking to an element of this, what we classically associate with the phrase the Western alliance hangs together or doesn't, and clearly it isn't in many senses. European countries, to a greater or lesser extent, very or rather sceptical, and as are others too. And then you sit that alongside how this is going down in America, and then a more narrow definition of that within the Make America Great Again MAGA movement of the Republican Party, many of whom are very sceptical about the idea of foreign military adventures. So where this goes from now in terms of how Donald Trump makes an argument both domestically and internationally, when he is not seeing those who might normally rally to America's support doing that, is going to be really interesting. And what bearing does that have on how long the the war goes on.
And then little sidebar story. So a couple of days ago in the Spectator magazine, their political editor, Tim Shipman, had a quite detailed leak from the National Security Council of the UK about which ministers were on which side of the argument about allowing the US to use British military bases to launch the attacks on Iran. And that's now the subject of a leak inquiry because the National Security Council is the one thing that should never leak.
Yes, I thought Tim Shipman is a master journalist, and it was a fascinating read. The thing I took away from it when I read it, the content was fascinating, but the thing I took away from it was, blimey, people are talking within, or who are involved in that particular forum. Leak inquiries at Westminster do not have a wildly positive track record from the perspective of those conducting the inquiries in terms of getting to a leaker.
Apart from trivia fans.
Oh, yeah.
A leak from the National Security Council under Theresa May, which was traced to Gavin Williamson, who then got fired.
Yes, that is true.
One of the few leak inquiries that went anywhere.
Yes, so the precedent does relate.
He denied
to
it
that
at the time.
Yeah, that particular forum. Interesting, but the vast majority don't, because most people tend to cover their tracks and make sure there isn't some sort of paper trail or digital trail, as it's more likely to be now. Given how digital our lives are, does it make it harder or easier to cover your tracks? Interesting. I think to definitively prove it, I think, unless people have been very slapdash, would, I suspect, be quite difficult.
I mean, in these leak inquiries, though, people do have to hand over their phones. And the Cabinet Secretary, Antonia Romeo, said in a letter that she was responding to from a Tory frontbencher who raised this, that she's taking it very seriously and will use all the tools at her disposal. And so presumably, if she decides that asking cabinet ministers to hand in their phones is one of the tools at her disposal, she'll do that.
Yep, that's true. Whether that definitively proves anything, let's see. But yeah, as you say, there's a precedent there, so you never know.
Chris, thank you very much, and thank you for your warm welcome back. And thank you for the reminder that the Mais Lecture is spelled M-A-I-S, not M-A-I-Z-E or M-A-Z-E.
Happy to be here for spelling inquiries.
B-Y-E.
T-A.
Right, the reason we're talking about the Mais Lecture is it's a big part of the financial calendar where a senior figure talks about fiscal or monetary or economic policy. And today it was Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, doing that in the City of London. And earlier on today, on Tuesday, I spoke to Faisal Islam because he was there at the speech, having gone on a visit with the Chancellor beforehand. And not massively exciting title, the Mais Lecture, but it turns out what Rachel Reeves had to say to the great and the good in the city was very intriguing, as Faisal explained. Hello, Faisal.
Hello, Adam.
Before we talk about the Mais Lecture, which is an important part of the financial calendar every year, even if lots of newscasters might not tune in for it, why is there a picture of you basically wearing dark glasses?
Oh, dear, yeah. Well, I thought they looked quite cool. They were yellow glasses, laser safety glasses, because I went to go and see, we've talked about this before, quantum computers, but the Brit-style quantum computers at the Oxfordshire National Quantum Computing Centre. And I had focused, when we'd spoken before about this, about Google's effort here, which is a massive fridge.
The coldest place on Earth.
Yes.
Because that's what you need
known
for this
universe, actually.
Right.
In fact, the Chancellor got excited about being the coldest place in Europe. So, however, there are different methods to make quantum work. And the thing that I was looking at there was something called trapped atoms, where you use lasers to trap single atoms, and then, and forgive me for this explanation, I don't know the missing links here, you somehow get the qubits that form the quantum computer. Entirely different.
And just to remind people how quantum works, and let's see if I can challenge myself here. So when you've got a normal classic computer, it uses binary where data is ones and zeros. Quantum allows you to go beyond ones and zeros.
Yes.
So you can do way more calculations in a much shorter time in a way that's just totally mind-bending compared to normal computers.
Particularly of calculations that kind of mimic nature. of slightly, massive calculations. Not every type of calculation, but yes. You're right.
And the reason you were looking at British flavoured quantum is because one of the three things that Rachel Reeves was talking about in her lecture today was embracing artificial intelligence and the next generation of computing, which is quantum. But before we talk about her numbered list, and she did a lot of numbered lists in this speech, what is the Mais Lecture? Why is it such a big deal for people in your world?
It has, forgive me, you might know better because you were looking at the list about how long it goes back, but I think we're talking 20, 30 years because I think we go back to
1978.
Oh, sorry, okay, longer than that. So almost as much as my entire life. So you go back to Lawson, famous lectures about, if you like, medium and long-term economic strategy shifts have been made at this lecture, which is associated with City University, now the Bayes Business School. And, so big decisions that last for years have been signalled at these sorts of lectures with a long list of former chancellors, shadow chancellors and the like. And so, we're very used to kind of looking at the ups and downs of the individual GDP number or the unemployment number or how they're going to respond to an individual budget. But, what is the strategy? So under Thatcherism, smaller state, monetarism, which is when you focus on the money supply, independent central banks, all the things that we've taken for granted in terms of macroeconomics, which when it's working, you shouldn't notice it. It's like the ball boys and girls at Wimbledon. When it's not working, we all notice it. These are the sorts of big intellectual shifts. It's known as a sort of intellectual framework for our medium to long-term economic plans.
And Rachel Reeves is the first person to give this lecture twice.
Yes, and I think I let you all into a little secret, which is she's rather proud of that fact, which I think goes, and the reason why I tell you that, it's not just to be indiscreet, it just goes a little bit way to explaining a slightly sort of inscrutable person, which is, genuinely very excited about the nerdish quality of being able to deliver a speech like this, about using media.
Yeah, because no one shouts at her or asks her hard questions during it.
Well, there were some hard questions. I would argue, but in terms of the impact, so yeah, you're right. It's not the short term what's in the headlines right now. In fact, that's kind of the opposite of what gets covered. But it's like how do you grow our cities? What's our relationship? We'll go on to this with Europe. What's going wrong in our relationship between the universities where we do amazing research and building the biggest businesses in the world. So it's things that affect us big time that sometimes we don't have the oxygen to discuss. We discuss it quite a lot, I seem to find.
We basically do a weekly Mais Lecture. You do it 52 times a year. No, but having said all that, though, there was a bit of kind of breaking daily news in it today, in that she acknowledged that the conflict between the US, Israel and Iran and the Straits of Hormuz being blockaded is going to lead to inflation increasing.
She did, but she again made this comment that we've heard from the Prime Minister, but I heard first from the Chancellor, which is really the only way out of this is de-escalation. And you may think, quite reasonably, that's just words. What does that even mean? I just wonder if some of the news we're hearing today about, from the Germans, for example, saying, we won't engage with, maritime help on the Straits of Hormuz until the Americans and Israelis have sorted out, essentially, I think, stopped what they're doing. You've heard about the idea that, Starmer has a plan that would help with unblocking the Straits of Hormuz, but presumably only as the result of the war having stopped.
Yeah.
And so they're keeping channels open with the Iranians. So you can start to see, and then if you take everything back and you sort of unwind the logic of this, which is how long is this inflationary bump going to last? And the answer is as long as the war. But if you assume that Donald Trump does not want this to go on in terms of the gasoline prices, it's a horrible way to look at everything, but maybe there's a certain truth to it, to the midterms in November, because this would be disastrous supposedly for him, then this ends in August. And the methodology is that before that is that President Trump withdraws and tells the Israelis to do so, and then it's over to the Europeans to persuade the Iranians not to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Now, sorry, that's very tentative, but that's the logic train that I think that she was pointing to.
Yeah, and so then she dived into the substance of this big lecture, and as you said, there was sort of 3 chapters to it. One of the chapters was about artificial intelligence. What's she planning there?
So a big injection of public cash over a decade, £2.5 billion, primarily on quantum that we talked about a minute ago, essentially to make sure, she wants to write what she sees as a pattern of great British invention. And you go back years on this, which since the 60s, 70s, we have failed to commercialise. We failed to create the world's biggest companies. We've had a very financialised economy where we're obsessed with the city. We're obsessed with prices and stuff like that, but not like real substantive, world-changing technology.
Like a British
companies.
unicorn.
Well, more than unicorn won't cut it. You're talking like a Microsoft or a Google or something like that. Where there's a company called Arm Holdings, which makes chips, which does very well, which is probably was our best bet in terms of that. But that was sold partly abroad. So that's the plan. And she feels that if you put the money into quantum now, even before the technology is solid, let alone we know what it can be used for.
The government will buy £1 billion worth of quantum computing when it's invented.
Essentially, in a few years' time, when you might argue it's not entirely certain that she'll be Chancellor. I think that's probably fair to say. We don't know.
But I suppose that's the government providing a market, isn't it?
Yeah.
And always becoming like an investor.
Yeah, and I know you're going to like this, which is like on social media I noticed this thing, and I was a bit suspicious of it because you get massive doom-monger and despondency about Britain on social media, but then suddenly I noticed the exact opposite, and it was so like, I was like, what's going on here? This thing called London Maxing.
Yeah.
Or Brit Maxing. Have you seen that?
I have.
With 2 X's.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the exact opposite. The idea of like, actually everyone slags off the UK or its capital, high crime rates, sort of Elon Musk style memes about the UK. But actually the environment for AI companies built around Google's DeepMind and others and our great universities is very, very positive right now. And this movement's got a name, London Maxing. It was so effusive that I thought, this can't be real. Didn't really think about it. People were talking about London Maxing in the audience of the Mais Lecture afterwards, and the general positive vibe given off by the Chancellor. And we've talked about this before, Adam, haven't we? Which is, the vibe we get from Westminster is incredibly despondent and doom-mongery, and it's not necessarily the case elsewhere, even as the economy is pretty flat in the first month. So in that area, so it's worth thinking about.
So
this
for people
London
who are
Maxing,
not fully tuned into the online jargon zeitgeist, this idea of London Maxing is basically people showing off about how great London is. And you did an example the other day, didn't you? You went to see a West End show.
Oh, yeah.
And you said how buzzing everything was.
I was surprised. You sort of imbibed.
What show did you go and see?
You absolutely know.
I don't know.
To say Wicked.
Oh,
with a 5 and a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe how packed everything out was. And this doesn't mean the economy's booming. It doesn't mean everything's perfect. But like set against the expectation. And so the bottom line is this: what are the proof? We shouldn't take our proof points from social media algorithms ever.
So basically, Rachel Reeves was trying to like quantum max today.
Quantum maxing, AI maxing, wants to
economy.
diffuse, and this is the key thing in terms of productivity, which drives growth, which is that AI diffuses across the economy. And so there's all sorts of initiatives being set up to help that, institutes and the like.
Oh, yeah, there's going to be an AI Economics Institute.
Yeah.
Modelled on Rishi Sunak's AI Safety Institute that he set up.
Now, that is interesting because I think that's a tacit acknowledgement that, yes, there is benefits to productivity. There's benefits to growth. She wants the UK to be at the forefront of that. There's also, in the transition, as they call it, some real issues, and we've talked about them before, around jobs and around, say, first entry graduate jobs and that. So there's a balancing act.
Right, let's transition into the second pillar of our Mais Lecture, which was about rebalancing economic growth across the whole of the UK.
Yeah.
To me, at first, that sounded like, here we go, levelling up version 556, which politician or chancellor has not been in favour of doing this for yonks.
Yeah.
What's different this time around?
So I think the first thing, which is very interesting, is that the reference point, levelling up, to be clear, didn't have a huge amount of strategic substance to it. It had a bit of money attached to it. It had some recycled European money that used to be European regional funds. It didn't. Lots of efforts were made and there was lots of rhetoric about it.
It never really took off.
But it wasn't that new either, because it was called regeneration before that, in the 2000s.
Yeah.
And we saw big transformations. My hometown, Manchester, places like Liverpool, Leeds, other places.
The Northern Powerhouse.
Even Barnsley, they were going to make into a Tuscan villa, and actually they sort of did. So you have these changes in
Europe. They were going to turn Barnsley into a Tuscan village.
Yeah, a Tuscan village based on Hilltown regeneration in Renaissance Italy, and this became a big joke in like politics in 2002 or 2003, I think it was. It was Will Alsop, very famous.
Oh yeah,
and I tell you what, I went to Barnsley on the way to Elland Road to see my team play against Leeds, and I popped in, and it was really, really beautiful and stunning. And as a guy from Manchester, I was surprised by that. So I guess that's a long way round of saying that we have had a history of regeneration of cities.
Yes.
It's cross-party, Michael Heseltine, people like Lord Adonis, people like
Who was a Labour
Manchester.
minister.
Yeah, there's been a consensus here
Yeah.
of a certain type of politician. Levelling Up was a sort of version of that. They didn't have, and then this is quite interesting, and I didn't expect this because the Chancellor announced yes, some more funding, yes, some more powers for Oxford, and the like. We've heard some of that before, but a new power for devolution, that powers would go to relevant mayors over the allocation of income tax spending, not the rates, but your revenue. What's that about? This is about, I would say, incentivizing cities to grow, to increase their population so that they get a tax base. Right, and then you keep some of that tax base. So you keep the proceeds of growth.
So Tracy Brabin in West Yorkshire will get to keep a certain percentage of how much income tax is generated by the people of West Yorkshire.
Exactly,
and she could spend that on her particular projects that she wants to spend.
Something like there's going to be a report come back at the budget in the autumn. I think the classic example would be Manchester, where you get a population in the city centre which was like 500 in 1980 and it's now 100,000 and I'm told could get to 250,000, and that Greater Manchester would benefit from the income tax generated from tens of thousands of increase in population. Now this is quite fascinating because when we talk about population growth, like in Westminster politics, more or less, it's like, oh, population's growing too fast. It's an immigration story. It's a small boat story. This is a rather different lens. It's quite normal. Like in America, that is a famous example.
It's a very sort of funky way of doing local house building targets, isn't it?
You just incentivize growth, like from the top. You incentivize smart local leaders. Like, I don't know if you remember The Wire, the mayor in The Wire. I can't do the accent. It's a brilliant accent. It's a British guy. Yeah. I've got to grow my tax base. I've got to increase my population. That is what this is, and it's to create localized incentives for transformation. So I think that's pretty radical. Depends on where it goes. Wasn't expecting
I'll believe it when I see it.
Well, and then someone pointed out very astutely, well, hang on, what if there's a bunch of Green or Reform mayors? Are they going to be so keen to be demarcating various amounts of the tax revenue for the opposition? In answer, they should be, because that would be the democratic will of the locals.
And also, we should remember, in Scotland, under devolution, there are different income tax rates for the Scottish government. So there's an example in the UK of where there's been quite radical, maybe not radical, putting it too strongly, but quite dramatic fiscal devolution. It does already exist.
Yeah, but I think this is about growing this is a big incentive for big cities to grow their populations with people that pay tax.
Then the third pillar of this speech was about alignment with the EU.
Yes.
What's Rachel Reeves' pitch here?
Now, we've heard some of this before, and it's like
She's been preparing people for this for a few weeks, hasn't she?
She has, I would say, a few months. This is a very slow tanker turning round. We've talked a lot about oil tankers the past few weeks. This is a very slow turning round of the tankers, but I think we're getting somewhere directionally in terms of how the economics and politics intertwine here. She's talked about, and the Prime Minister talked about, alignment with the single market. This was their great answer to the customs union push from the Greens, the Lib Dems, from some people in their own party. Was actually, no, not the customs union. Have a look at single market alignment in certain sectors.
Basically having the same rules as the EU on
realigning
things.
that we did with the EU, and that means you would get, certainly for regulatory purposes, frictionless trade. There'd still be some customs checks and things like that, but you still get frictionless trade. They're doing this already on food, farm and energy. This is being negotiated right now as part of the existing reset. The question for me was, how ambitious are they in terms of the other sectors? And what she said today was, by default, we would align, but there would be some exceptions where there'd be regulatory divergence where it benefits. And the test would be some sort of cost-benefit analysis of what business wants, of what would create jobs and the like. But I think she has moved things along. She's created, I think, a situation where, for example, potentially the chemicals industry, advanced manufacturing, aviation, and others would make a case that would be heard, and they have the powers to do this with their majority, for realignment, we should say, with the European Union in order to get those sectors into the single market. Now, the European Union would have to agree. She made a big kind of plea to the Europeans in the context of this. So be more flexible. So let's not the cake argument.
Well,
give us some cake.
Because I was going to say, what does this mean for negotiations with Brussels? Does this mean adding in extra chapters to the already existing negotiations that you just mentioned? Or is this a much more subtle thing of we independently in the UK will arrange ourselves so that we're like this, so that we get the benefits that way?
Yeah. So I think the existing negotiation goes on, but then creates a sort of scaffolding for including, remember that controversial debate that was had in the Brexit years about European Court of Justice jurisdiction and all this sort of stuff. You create precedents, and then I think go out to the sectors and to business and say, do you want this? I don't think they're going to front run businesses, but if businesses want it, it's there.
Because I just think, and not that I hang out in Brussels anymore, but I can imagine people in Brussels saying, oh, it's like Brexit again. Just tell us what you want.
Yeah.
And actually, Rachel Reeves hasn't really told Brussels, hasn't given them a list of requests today.
She was trying to create an atmosphere within which better, more constructive conversations. You know, some people will argue the old Barnier argument about having cake and all that sort of stuff. Well, I think essentially that, yes, they think cake should be on offer when they can, in this new world. So what else has changed? We've been talking about Donald Trump, we've been talking about Iran, we've been talking about Greenland. They're also fearful that some of the responses to that Trump world in Europe would be made in the EU rather than made in Europe. There's some moves being made there that she was adamant that they should avoid. But in general terms, a more flexible, positive, the Brexit negotiation was separating out, and in theory, in terms of trade relations, create more barriers. This is a totally different vibe because it's to kind of bring those back down again. And
this would basically take us to like Theresa May's Chequers plan.
I think that
which was sort of quasi membership of the single market,
or a Swiss style deal. This is the sort of thing that they won't say.
Lots and lots of different agreements.
No, but they are being quite nervous about it, and they're tiptoeing around it. I think if you layer the politics on top of this is where I think it gets really interesting, because we're now, how many years are we out now from potential Labour manifesto? What is the politics saying of the Greens kind of chomping at the bit to take Labour votes, mainly Remainy votes? Younger people voting age 16 plus, you can start to see a pathway where they're arguing, as she did today, that the economics of alignment is better for trade. That is disputed. There'll be debates about that. But for the Labour politics of this, and in terms of any like leadership contests and the like, could you see a complete mirror image of what we saw with UKIP and the Conservatives 10 years ago? Could we see that evolve now with the Greens and the Labour Party? I think it's very, very interesting. And I guess the question it poses to me, which is just me thinking out of the box, is this now on a sort of pathway, a glide path towards a Labour manifesto offer of some sort of referendum on joining the single market? If 5 or 6 sectors are already in, it becomes an incremental step. Discuss. I don't know. No one's told me that. I'm just like trying to work out how it all sits together, which is why I think this speech was pretty important, right? And why I think her going further than I had expected matters.
But of course, Rachel Reeves cannot defy political or economic gravity.
Very good. Very good.
Little reference to Wicked there for anyone who didn't get it. Faisal, thank you.
Thank you.